Hello, everybody. Brilliant to be with you here today, and I'm very grateful to Cirque for inviting me. So, I woke up this morning very excited about this presentation, and then I looked at the agenda, and I got even more excited when I looked at the range of speakers you've got. Certainly, I think the UK could learn a lot from Canada with regard to what you do with concussion, and I think having a lineup like you've got today, in terms of having athletes, researchers, clinicians, ministers, people working for sporting organisations, is a really good way forward. So, yeah, it should be a great day, and I'm really grateful to be here. So in terms of financial disclosures, I don't have any conflicts of interest. These are my employed roles that I have in the UK. And just a little bit about me. I am a physiotherapist, so I'm a clinician by background. I've been working in parasport, so disability sport, in the UK for almost 20 years now, which is gone by in the blink of an eye, to be honest. I dug out this photo from 2008, which is my first Paralympic Games, which is now over 15 years ago, and it really does feel like yesterday. But I've been very lucky, and I've been to, I think, 16 or 17 World or European Championships with various sporting squads that have got disabled athletes in there. My concussion journey began in 2008 when I went to the University of Otago in New Zealand, did my PhD on the area of sports concussion and social media, so using Facebook to help young adolescents with a concussion return to play. And in recent years, I've been lucky enough to live my dream. And for 3 days a week, I work at the Football Association as a physiotherapy lead for para football. So we've got 7 elite squads, including blind men, blind women, deaf women, cerebral palsy men, partially sighted men, power chair. So we've got lots of different impairment groups that play football internationally for England, and they travel all over the world. I also, like many people that work in parasport, volunteer with different governance roles to try and help sport become safer. And I'm also co-chair of the Concussion in Parasport group, which I'll be talking about in a few minutes' time. So in terms of my talk today, I'm going to outline the current landscape in terms of concussion in parasport, talk a lot about the Concussion in Parasport group, of which there are some of our members presenting later today as well. And I'm going to try and give a bit of a précis and a summary of the international efforts and collaborations that are going on in relation to parasport concussion, as well as touching on the future areas that we hope to achieve some great successes in with regard to helping our athletes. So one quick thing to tidy up at the start, I thought I'd go into some of the terminology specifics. So a lot of people have heard the word Paralympian and the Paralympics. So essentially those are the sporting events in the winter and the summer that take place once every 4 years. So an athlete becomes a Paralympian once they've taken part in those games. Now, what we do know is that that's a very elite level of parasport, but there's lots of other athletes that do play parasport that don't play at a Paralympic Games. So these are people with a disability that may play in a Paralympic affiliated sport or even a sport that's not affiliated to the Paralympics, but they are still a para athlete. So a lot of this presentation today is going to be focused on the para athlete and not just the 23 or 24, I think it is, Paralympic sports that are out there. So I wanted to put a bit of a line in the sand really as to what happened before 2021. So in the world of parasport concussion, 2021 was quite an important year. And prior to this date, clinicians that were working in the area and the athletes that they serve were guided by the latterly consensus statements with regard to concussion in sport, and prior to that they were summary and agreement statements. And I think many people on the call, and certainly the researchers and clinicians here, will know these statements inside out, back to front. But what you probably know is that all of the statements, including the 2016 one, had no mention of para athletes or para concussion in there. So all the information that clinicians would use to help their para athletes would be adapted from the mainstream studies. And to give quite a basic example, we know that the female concussion specific issues are very different to male concussion specific issues. So again, there was a similar pattern of trying to transpose data and evidence and recommendations from one group of individuals onto another. The phrase that I keep coming back to and that I do quite like is the phrase diverse heterogeneity. So basically within para athletes, there's lots of different individuals with lots of different impairments, and within each impairment group there are differences there as well. So that really does sum up the different challenges that you face as a clinician working in para sport. And again, I keep coming back to it, the lack of framework and guidance to help clinicians like myself working in the field was a real challenge, to be honest. And ultimately, that meant that there's a lack of equity, really, for our para athletes when it comes to concussion management, because there's a lack of evidence-based and, I suppose, guidance for the clinicians that are looking after them. So I wanted to use this video to highlight a sport which unsurprisingly does have quite a high rate of concussion. Now this is blind football, so all the individuals in this sport are registered blind, and to make sure they can't see anything at all, they also have a blindfold that's worn over their eyes to block out any light perception as well. So I'll just run this video and you can see an example of concussion in parasport.
Oh, and Nonato in front. Strong block by Erkan, who was right in the way. There was a clash of heads as Nonato went to take the shot. And both men are in need of treatment.
Okay, so that's from the 2016 Paralympic Games in Rio. And unsurprisingly, if you take 8 visually impaired athletes, place them in a small pitch, encourage them to run around a lot and try and score goals, you will get collisions. So certainly this is one of the higher end sports for concussions in the para space, and you can see exactly why there. So the Concussion in Parasport group that I mentioned before, or SIPS as we call ourselves, was formed in 2020. During the pandemic, we got together online. Initially, it was going to be a face-to-face meeting in London at Wembley Stadium, but unfortunately that didn't happen because of COVID and the travel restrictions that were imposed. Now, the snowball recruitment that we took to create the SIPS group came about through word of mouth primarily, new individuals that worked in the para space, athletes as well. We got involved because their insight, as we're going to see today with the athletes that we've got as part of the symposium, is really, really important. And I suppose our initial aim was to try and create that preliminary guidance that I mentioned before was lacking to help the management of concussion in the para athletes. Now, I'm happy to say that since 2020, we've had 11 triannual online meetings. So 3 times a year we get together with individuals from all over the world. We don't have any funding or commercial association, so we're non-profit in that regard. And although we've got an increased representation, as you'll see in the coming slides, we do still have some gaps there. So Asia, Africa, and Australasia are underrepresented in terms of our group at the moment, which unfortunately is in keeping with concussion research generally, as we know that North America and Europe have got the bulk of the research and expertise and capacity with regards to that. So I mentioned about our first aim, and we achieved that first aim. It was really, really proud moment for all of us back in 2021 to have the first position statement of the Concussion in Parasport group published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. It was very much the first start on a long journey that's going to be going on, hopefully, for as many years as I'm working and beyond, in terms of helping our athletes with a disability to have their concussion managed better and assessed better. But yeah, it was a big day for all of us, having put a lot of work into that paper. Now, one thing we did do as part of the process was create a traffic light system where we took the existing SCAT5, as it was then, so Sport Concussion Assessment tool, and tried to highlight the areas that would be either completely applicable, which are the green ones, partly applicable but might need modification, which are the yellow ones, and things that weren't applicable to para athletes at all, which were the red ones. So as I mentioned before, that diverse heterogeneity, lots of different groups, meant that we had to think about lots of different impairments that our athletes have. So with regards to the paper, we had a big appendices that's 60 odd pages, 62 or 63, I think it is, with these traffic light systems in. And we hope that that would be a really valuable resource for clinicians to refer to, look at, and use in order to help make decisions about what assessments and what management strategies they'd use with their para athletes. In addition to trying to get the word out through the paper, there was also a BJSM podcast that Dr. Richard Wheeler, who was the lead author of the statement, put together. And there was also an infographic that we pulled together that's got QR codes that you can see there, which allows clinicians to go to those tools that I mentioned. So really useful in terms of being able to access those pitch side as well. And again, we're really trying to push these resources. So as was mentioned at the start of the talk today, please do share, educate, and assist anyone you know with regard to sharing these resources here. Quick shout out to the introductory members of the Concussion in Parasport group, and one in particular, Dr. Jamie Kissick, who I know is somebody that was very loved in Canada. I was fortunate enough to consider Jamie a good friend as well as a colleague. So his loss last year was a huge one for all of us to take. But yeah, just wanted to mention and give respect to Jamie as part of this. And I'm also really pleased to say that there's several members of our Concussion and Parasport group that will be presenting today. So Francois, Francine, Anna, Katie, Shalina, really proud to have you and to be presenting with you today, and hope your presentations go well. I've intentionally not talked about the Canadian parasport research in this because I know you guys are talking later. So the international approaches I'm talking about now are not going to include your work. So the collaborations extended. So once we had our Concussion in Parasport group position statement done, two of our members, myself and Dr. Sherry Blowett, pictured in the photo there on the right, were invited onto the Concussion in Sport Scientific Committee, which was a huge honour. It was the direction that we wanted to go into. We really wanted to make para-concussion research and para-sport involvement in the concussion space a lot more mainstream. And what better way to do that than to work with the world experts and world leaders for that. Dr. Catherine Schneider in the photo there as well. She obviously is presenting later today, and Catherine was a huge advocate and support for the para research space, and continues to be as well. So looking forward to continuing collaborations with Catherine. As part of the 2022 Amsterdam Consensus Conference, myself and Sherry delivered a session on parasport concussion considerations. We also had a para-athlete, which was there presenting in the athlete voice session. So again, it was wonderful to have a visually impaired downhill skier from the UK talk about her concussion symptoms and her concussion journey. So I think a lot of the audience that were there, if anybody's listening that was there as well, will say that was a really powerful session. I suppose as good as anything was having acknowledgement in all of the systematic review discussions that there was an absence of para concussion in there. So although in an ideal world we'd love there to be para content in each of the systematic reviews that were done, even having people say there is no para research in this area meant that we were on the map. It meant that people were thinking about it, and hopefully means that that will help to drive the research agenda in the coming years. Myself and Sherry were both involved in the consensus statement that came through. And as a result of that, we had the first ever mention in a concussion in sport group consensus statement related to parasport. So the 5 or 6 paragraphs that I've got on the page here that you can see for yourself in the consensus statement aren't groundbreaking, because they're essentially a lot of the information that we had in our first concussion in parasport group statement, but just having that highlighted front and center to people reading the consensus statement was a huge moment for parasport, and hopefully will have a trickle down effect to our athletes, because that's the whole reason why we're here and the whole reason why we're doing what we're doing. So in terms of what we do and don't know about concussion in parasport right now, we know that there is a limited number of data-driven studies. Now, as scientists and researchers and clinicians, we really like prospective studies that are focused on concussion, because that gives us a data that allows us to look at modifiable risk factors and prevention, but we don't have that in the parasport space at the moment. The International Paralympic Committee have collected data. They started at the 1996 Paralympics, and at each winter and summer Paralympic Games, they do collect data that is related to that. So there are pinch points where data related to concussion and head injury in parasport does come through. But unfortunately, as I mentioned before, not all para athletes are involved in the Paralympics. There's lots of other parasport events. There's lots of other individuals with a disability that play sport away from those organised structures. So again, collecting that data is a challenge, and it's something that we really want to work towards and get better at. And I think in keeping with the findings from the concussion in sport group at the Amsterdam Consensus, they mentioned there a lot about the lack of data related to female and paediatric specific factors in concussion as a whole. And I think when it comes to parasport, that's just as relevant, really, that there's a lot that we don't know about female para considerations and paediatric para considerations as well. So I just wanted to highlight 4 examples of international research that's taken place looking at concussion in parasport, and got some colleagues and friends from Sweden that have done a very good study looking at smartphone app for self-tracking and self-reporting. So they took elite Swedish male and female athletes, collected the data that was done through self-reporting over a year, and unsurprisingly, athletes with visual impairment had some of the highest incidence of concussion. And interestingly, they found that the concussion rates were comparative to mainstream sports as well. So again, that's something we still don't know definitively, but is increasingly becoming more apparent to us that concussion is as much of an incidence in parasport as it is in mainstream sport. Moving across to the USA now. So this study here by Ryan Moran and colleagues, again, was one that really excited me because what they looked to do is expand upon existing concussion assessment tools, specifically the BESS, the Balance Error Scoring System, and adapt it for a para population to make it more applicable to them. So these wheelchair athletes, male and female, I think they were basketball players and tennis players, were given a different way to assess their balance, and that's the WES, so the Wheelchair Error Scoring System. And that was used as a modified balance assessment to get that larger holistic picture in terms of post-concussion assessment and also baseline testing. So what the researchers found is that using the wheelchair error scoring system provided them with an alternative and a viable alternative compared to the best. So this is exactly where we want to get to as a concussion and parasport group, getting specific tests for our different cohorts that allow information to be gained to help their management and ultimately help them return to sport safely. So for me, this is a really important landmark study. Another study that I really enjoyed reading was this one from Japan. So in the 2020 Paralympic Games that was obviously hosted in 2021, they used a retrospective video analysis to look at head collisions in blind football. So just like the video I shared earlier, there were 18 games at the 2020 Paralympic Games, and through the data that was collected there, they noted differences between the different phases of the game when the head impacts occurred. So for example, dribbling and attacking versus defending. And that, what we know is from what we've seen from other sports is having that retrospective video analysis and a better understanding of injury mechanisms leads to potentially being able to put in place injury prevention approaches. And probably also will highlight the fact that the same group also undertook video analysis with wheelchair rugby at the Tokyo Paralympic Games. Now that was looking at falls rather than head impact. So obviously with falls, head impacts do arise from that as well. But again, that's another interesting study that I'd like to signpost people towards. And last but not least, England. I've been fortunate enough to work with Dr. Richard Wheeler on a lot of his PhD studies, and one of his PhD studies was a qualitative study looking at blind footballers. Now, this one was a mixture of retired players and current players. And again, it's really, really fascinating to hear some of their stories and experiences related to their concussion. Some of them not even knowing that they were concussed, some of them feeling that the concussion tests that are used by clinicians are biased towards people that can see. A lot of them reporting symptoms that are probably a bit different to those that you'd typically associate with concussion. So yeah, really, really interesting study and privileged to be a part of this one. We also worked really hard to try and get the findings of this study out there to the end users. Now, Peter Drury, who's a high-profile football commentator, or soccer commentator, sorry, he's on the television, everybody knows his voice. Now, we were able to approach him, and he actually narrated the whole paper, the whole scientific paper from start to finish, narrated it, recorded it, and we were able to share that as well, because what we wanted to do is get those findings out to the end users, which are the blind footballers, so they could listen to the paper, understand more about it, and hopefully impact on their own understanding of concussion. So these were some of the key findings that we had from our study. And again, this is all open access, so you'd be able to find this paper, and obviously the slides are all listed on the CIRC website as well. And again, we were able to generate an infographic from this that we hope will, again, help clinicians, help other researchers that are looking to explore this space, and also had QR codes to link back to those on-pitch assessment tools that I mentioned before from the first position statement. Now, looking towards the future, the SIPS position statement is still our Bible, I suppose, in terms of parasport. So that's the thing that we keep trying to push and nudge people towards, and signpost clinicians that work in parasport towards. But equally, as I mentioned before, we really want to stimulate research to get more data-driven studies so that we can actually look at numbers, understand more about baselines, get better in terms of helping our athletes. So that's certainly a key objective for us. Our collaborations with the Concussion Sport Group are going to continue. We're looking forward to working with them ahead of the next consensus statement in a few years' time. And I suppose our goal and our target as a group is to make sure that there's enough research out there that there could be a systematic review in a few years' time done on parasport research in general, and certainly will have moved on significantly if we are in a position where we're able to do that. And again, I touched on it before, I think it's a bigger picture issue, but really want to try and make sure that there are structures and processes in place whereby we can collect epidemiological data from parasport events, across the year, across the world, and not just at those once every 4-year Paralympic Games in the winter and in the summer. In terms of additional resources as well that I'll signpost people towards, I worked and collaborated with the American Academy of Neurology last year to create a short NeuroBite, which is a video snippet that they put out for sort of 4 or 5 minutes education for the American Academy of Neurology fellows, I think it is. So that's out there on YouTube. And again, the links are all at the end of this presentation. I'm really pleased to be working with Dr. Schneider on the MOOC, massive open online course related to concussion, and generating the para-concussion element for that one. And I also worked with some of the interns at the Concussion Alliance to create a website and some resources for them for individuals with a pre-existing disability related to concussion. So really just trying to find different avenues to get the word and the education out there, I suppose. So closing thoughts, these are probably not going to be a surprise linked to everything I've said before, but I think Socrates nailed it here in terms of wisdom, in terms of being that you know nothing. And certainly I wouldn't say we know nothing in terms of paraconcussion at the moment, but certainly there's a long way that we need to go in terms of understanding more to help our athletes and protect them. And data is where it comes from. We need that data, and that's what we're working towards as a group. So in closing, I just want to thank the colleagues in the Concussion and Parasport group, both here at the Sport Symposium today and worldwide, Richard and Sherry in particular for the work that they've done, and obviously want to honour Dr. Jamie Kissick, and hopefully he's watching down and very proud of the work that we've done in this area. And again, resources, references, all on the slides for you, and happy to answer any questions now or at a later stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Osman. What an amazing way to kick off the symposium. We've had a couple questions already come in. So the first question is, are there any adapted SCAT tools for para-athletes?
At the moment, the adaptations that we made as part of our appendices for the position statement are as close as it gets. I wanted to highlight the WES test before, because again, in terms of an adaptation to the existing tool, that's another really good one. But aside from that, there are areas that we're working on. There's areas that I know Francois and Francine will probably be talking about this afternoon as well. But yeah, that's probably about the extent of it at the moment.
Okay, amazing. And we'll get some resources from you too. And if they're not already up on the CERC portal, they'll be up on the CERC portal after this presentation. So we'll make sure we keep sharing all of that amazing research. So thank you. So my next question for you is, what does or will the update process look like for the SIPs, and when could we expect or hope for another update?
So we made a decision a little while ago as a group that probably updating the whole position statement at the moment isn't something that we feel is probably timely or relevant, because we don't have an excess of data for that. What we are currently working on is a discussion statement, I suppose, looking at the previous Amsterdam consensus statement and how that relates to para. So several of the Concussion and Parasport group are working on that, including some of the Canadian ones. So hopefully you won't have to wait too long for that. That's in progress at the moment.
Amazing. Okay, well, we will keep our eyes peeled for that. Okay, our chat box is going crazy here, Osman, so a few more questions coming your way. So the next question is actually around baseline testing. And the question is, if you don't have a baseline for the SCAT-5, should it still be used for para-athletes?
Baseline testing is super important because of the complexities of para-athletes. So there's going to be, there are studies out there, I didn't go into the data today, but there's a study that I was involved with looking at baseline testing for blind and cerebral palsy footballers. And we do know their concussion baselines do vary considerably. I think taking a SCAT-5 from an athlete that doesn't have a baseline can give some useful information, because obviously that would log signs, symptoms, and give some numerical data. Without a baseline to compare that to, the value of that probably isn't as great as what it would be otherwise. But certainly in the absence of that, I probably would proceed with that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question for you is, how can sport organizations support research and data collection in para-athletes? I know we've got a lot of sport organizations on the call here, so how can they help you?
It's tricky because, I mean, funding is part of it, and I know not all sports organisations are flush, and I know especially parasport organisations are not flush. I think probably a pipe dream would be to see universities collaborate with parasport organisations to offer expertise, maybe at a doctoral level or master's level, where students could use sporting events as potentially data collection events, that could be fairly cost effective, and it could be a way to allow parasport organisations to capture that epidemiological data in a robust way that would then hopefully feed back to injury prevention models. So that's one thought I do have.
Okay, amazing. I think that's going to be a theme for the day today, Osman, that we all just need to work together to advance research and to advance practice. So thank you for hammering that point home. So another question for you is, what are some key differences for concussion management in para-athletes that our audience should be aware of?
Oh, where to start?
It's a loaded question.
Yeah. There's lots, basically. I think one of the things that we talked about was probably being a bit more respectful about timescales of return to play. So certainly taking the example of athletes that have had a stroke, TBI, or cerebral palsy, they're only playing their sport because of their inherent brain injury. So in essence, they've had a second brain injury in addition to the one that they've already had. So probably extended return to play timescales for those athletes, although not evidence-based as such, probably does make a lot of sense from a management and welfare perspective. So that's probably one thing to consider, I think, when working with those athletes in particular.
Amazing. Okay, our next question for you, Oz, is how can sport organizations be inclusive of all disabilities in their concussion policies and protocols?
Again, very tricky, because I suppose it depends on the country where you live and the sports that are popular there. Certainly over in Canada, you guys have it cold. You have a lot of snow, so your alpine sports system is probably a lot more advanced than it would be in England or Egypt, where some of my family lives. So I think probably looking at the sports that are set up in that country, looking at the participation levels probably, and then trying to pitch your resources in keeping with that would probably allow the biggest safety net for the people that are participating in the biggest sports within each country.
Okay, that's amazing. Okay, another question for you is, what are some key next steps for highlighting this information, or for getting this information rather, out to more sport clubs to improve care of para-athletes? And I guess I'll just add on a piece, what can we in this Zoom room do to support you in your efforts of getting this information out to athletes and coaches?
Talking. So I think the more that we can push it and the more that we can have these conversations, members of the Concussion and Parasport group be invited to events like this is fantastic, because hopefully people will take away that a man with a funny accent spoke about disabled people, and they'll tell some other people, and then the word will kind of spread that way. So obviously we're trying to pitch it to the major sporting organisations as well. Members of the Concussion and Parasport group also sit on the International Paralympic Committee group, so we do have contacts and networks through there. We're pushing to get more education events at things like the Paralympic Games, so we can actually go to those events and do education sessions with the athletes and support staff there. So multimodal approaches really, but talk, communicate and share.
Okay, so a call to action for everybody in this room here today. Let's work on, after the symposium, sharing what we've learned and just spreading the word so we can all work together to improve awareness around concussion and policies and protocols. Okay, so I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. So I've got a little bit more of a personal question that came in here. What has been a highlight for you as a clinician working with these amazing athletes?
Oh, that's a very good question. From a non-sporting perspective, anybody that's worked at a Paralympic Games, goes to the opening ceremony, wears a funny suit and walks around behind the flag of their nation with however many thousand people in the audience, that's a really, really big moment, and something I'll always remember, both in Beijing and in Rio. In terms of performance-wise, there's been a couple of really good finals that we've been involved with. We lost to the World Champions Ukraine at the cerebral palsy football final in June last year in Italy. And just to get to a final as a support staff member for any sport is a big buzz and a big highlight. So, yeah.
Amazing. Okay, I think we've got, and congratulations on all of that, Oz, and it's so cool and so amazing. Okay, we've got time for one last question here. So it is another question actually around the baseline testing. So one of our audience members is wondering, how often do we need to do the baseline testing? Particularly they're inquiring about for blind athletes.
Blind athletes, yeah. I suppose we at the Football Association do annual baseline testing for all of our athletes. I think with blind athletes, depending on the condition, there might be mileage in terms of maybe biannually. potentially, if they've got a degenerative condition and you've got concerns that either subjectively or objectively things might have changed within that time frame, potentially biannually would be relevant. But again, we don't have data for that, so it's probably feel your way through it and sort of go from there, I think.
Okay. All right, Osman, thank you so much. This was such an incredible talk. I know I learned so much, and I'm sure our audience did too. And I just want to say how grateful we all are that you're, spearheading this research with your amazing team to keep advancing our knowledge of concussion and parasport. So thank you again so much for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it.